The soil was still under my fingernails when I saw her standing at the edge of the porch light's reach, a silhouette so familiar it made the air in my lungs turn to lead. We had spent 6 hours in the rain, my brother and I, digging until the hole was deep enough that the cold smell of the earth swallowed the sound of our shovels, ensuring the heavy wooden lid wouldn't move once the dirt was packed back down. We did it because we had to. Because the thing that had been wearing my sister's face for the last 3 weeks had stopped blinking and started humming a frequency that made the glass in the windows spiderweb. But there she was, or there it was, standing perfectly still with the same yellow raincoat she'd been wearing when she fell into the quarry, only now the yellow was muted by a fine dusting of the very same red clay I had just finished tamping down over her grave. I didn't scream because my throat had forgotten how to function, and as I watched her, I realized she wasn't breathing, but the hem of her coat was swaying ever so slightly, even though the wind had died down hours ago. I retreated into the kitchen, locking the deadbolt with hands that felt like they belonged to someone else, and I sat on the floor watching the gap under the door, waiting for a shadow to block the sliver of moonlight. It never came, but when I woke up the next morning, there was a single damp clump of red clay sitting in the center of the kitchen table, perfectly round and still cold to the touch. I called Elias, but his phone just hissed with that same low-frequency hum we'd heard in the bedroom before we took her to the woods, a sound like 1,000 bees vibrating inside a lead pipe. I drove to his house, the sun feeling thin and useless against the grey sky, and found his front door wide open. The house was empty, but the television was on, tuned to a channel of pure static that seemed to be pulsing in time with my own heartbeat. I found a note on his counter that just said the rules have changed, written in a handwriting that started as his and ended in a jagged looping script that looked like bird tracks. I didn't go into his basement. I knew better than to look for answers in dark places now. Instead, I went back to the woods, back to the spot marked by the 3 twisted oak trees, and my stomach dropped through the floor of the world. The grave hadn't been dug up. The dirt was still packed tight, the stones we'd placed on top undisturbed, and the moss was already beginning to knit itself back over the wound in the earth. But sitting right on top of the mound was a small hand-carved wooden doll I hadn't seen since we were children, its painted eyes replaced with 2 shiny black pebbles that seemed to follow me as I backed away. I realized then that burying the body hadn't been the end. It had just been a planting. Every day after that, the house felt smaller, the corners darker, and the reflections in the mirrors stayed a fraction of a second longer than I did. I started noticing the patterns in the neighborhood, the way the birds would stop singing at exactly 4:12 p.m. every afternoon, and how the neighbor's dog would bark at the empty air until its throat went raw. One night, I found the back door unlocked again, and when I walked into the hallway, I saw the damp footprints leading from the mudroom straight to my bedroom door. They weren't muddy, they were just wet, leaving a trail of clear, freezing water that smelled like stagnant pond depths and old cedar. I stood outside my own room for an hour, listening to the sound of someone turning the pages of a book inside, the soft crinkle of paper being the only sound in the suffocating silence. When I finally found the courage to push the door open, the room was empty, but my bed was neatly made, and my sister's favorite ribbon was tied in a perfect bow around my pillow. It was a warning, or perhaps a thank you. I tried to leave the town, driving until the fuel light flickered, but no matter which road I took, I always ended up passing the same rusted water tower and the same boarded-up diner at the edge of the woods. The geography had folded in on itself, trapping me in a loop of familiar streets that felt increasingly like a stage set. I started seeing her more often then, always at a distance, always in that yellow coat, standing in the middle of a field or sitting on a park bench with her back to me. She never moved, never spoke, but the air around her seemed to shimmer with a heavy, oily heat. I began to understand that she wasn't trying to scare me. She was waiting for me to acknowledge the new reality she had brought back with her from the dark. I found Elias's truck parked by the quarry a week later, the keys still in the ignition, and a half-eaten sandwich on the passenger seat, but no sign of him. On the dashboard, he had scratched a single word into the plastic: "Listen." So I sat there in his truck and I listened. I heard the wind. I heard the distant grind of the highway, and then, underneath it all, I heard the humming again, coming from deep within the earth. It wasn't one voice anymore, it was a chorus, a low rhythmic thrumming that felt like it was vibrating in my very marrow. I realized then that we hadn't buried her deep enough, or perhaps we had buried her in exactly the right place for whatever lived down there to find her. The town feels different now, the faces of the people I pass in the grocery store appearing slightly off, their expressions lagging by a heartbeat, their eyes a little too bright. I stay in my house mostly, keeping the lights on even though I know shadows don't need the dark to hide. I've started finding the pebbles everywhere, in my shoes, under my tongue when I wake up, lined up along the windowsill like little soldiers. Last night, I heard a soft tapping on the glass of my second-story window, a gentle, rhythmic sound like a fingernail clicking against the pane. I didn't look. I knew if I looked, I'd see her hovering there, gravity no longer applying to the thing that came back. I just closed my eyes and tried to remember the way the sun felt before the dirt got under my nails, before I realized that some things don't stay under the ground, because the ground itself is what wants them back. There is a weight in the room with me now, a presence that feels like damp wool and cold earth, and though the chair in the corner is empty, I can see the velvet fabric dipping down as if someone is sitting there, watching me write this. The humming is louder tonight, and I can almost make out the words in the vibration, a soft, repetitive chant that sounds like my own name being pulled through a sieve. I don't think I'm alone in this house anymore, and I don't think I'm the one who owns the keys. Sometimes I wonder if I'm the one who stayed buried, and she's the one who's actually home. The sun is setting again, and the shadows are reaching out from the corners like long, thin fingers, and I can hear the sound of a yellow raincoat brushing against the hallway wall, slow and steady, coming closer with every beat of my heart. I opened the basement door today because I heard Elias's voice calling from behind the furnace, but when I got down there, the only thing I found was his watch laying in a pile of fresh, damp salt. The watch was still ticking, but the numbers on the face were moving backward, and the ticking sound wasn't mechanical, it was the sound of a small throat clicking in rhythm. I realized the salt wasn't to keep things out, it was being exuded from the walls themselves, a white crust that felt like frozen skin. I stood in the center of the basement and realized that the floor was no longer concrete. It was a layer of tightly packed hair, thousands of strands woven together to form a carpet that felt warm beneath my boots. When I looked back at the stairs, the door had been replaced by a wall of that same yellow fabric from the raincoat, pulsing softly like a giant lung. I didn't try to leave then, I just sat on the hair-covered floor and waited for the light to change. But the light down there is a shade of purple that doesn't exist in the world above. I started to see the others then, the people from the town who had gone missing over the years, all of them standing perfectly still in the shadows, their faces smooth and featureless like unbaked bread. They weren't dead, they were just paused, waiting for the humming to reach the right note so they could begin their work. If you can feel the air in your room thickening as I speak, you need to stay with me until the very last word of this account, because once the humming starts in your own walls, there is no turning back. I saw my brother among them, his hand still holding the shovel we used that night, but the shovel was now part of his arm, the wood and metal fused into his bone and muscle. He didn't look at me, but he whispered my name, and the sound came from his chest instead of his mouth. He told me that the earth is hungry for names, and that once it eats your name, you become a part of the architecture of the quiet. I went back upstairs, but the house was different. The hallway was longer than it should be, and the windows showed a landscape of endless red clay mounds as far as the eye could see. There is no town left, only the memory of one projected onto the fog. I found a mirror in the bathroom and I didn't see my face. I saw a hole in the shape of a man, filled with the same black pebbles I'd been finding in my shoes. I understood then that I had been back from the woods for a long time and the burial wasn't for her. It was a ritual to wake the rest of us up. The scratching at the door isn't a threat anymore. It's an invitation, and I can feel the salt beginning to form on my own skin, a white crust that smells like the sea and the deep, deep dark. I'm going to open the door now, not because I want to, but because my hands aren't mine anymore. They belong to the rhythm of the humming, and the humming is saying that the celebration is about to begin. The yellow coat is hanging in the hall, but it's empty, waiting for me to step inside and find out what it feels like to never have to breathe again. I can hear the shovel starting up outside, thousands of them hitting the red clay in perfect unison, digging a hole large enough for the whole world to fit inside. The sky is turning the color of a bruise, and the black pebbles are starting to fall from the ceiling like rain, each one hitting the floor with the sound of a name being forgotten. I'm not scared anymore, I'm just heavy. So very heavy, like I'm made of the same lead pipe the bees are trapped in. If you want to know what happened to the others who opened their doors before the static took them, you should subscribe and listen to the remaining files in this archive, because the red clay is spreading much faster than the maps suggest. The door is creaking open, and the smell of wet earth is filling the room, and I can see the sister I buried standing there, her eyes finally blinking, her hand reaching out to show me the way back down. She isn't smiling, but she looks satisfied, the way a gardener looks at a seed that has finally broken through the surface. I'm going to go with her now, into the purple light and the salt, and I'm going to find out what happens when the ticking finally reaches zero. The house is dissolving into static, the walls are turning into fog, and the only thing left is the sound of the raincoat brushing against the air, a soft final sigh that says, "We are all home now."